I handed my only son $85,000 from my retirement account to build his fitness app, and 2 days after my husband died, I found a small wooden box with a single line in his handwriting that said, "Do not trust Daniel." That box and what it set in motion ended with me owning the entire company outright. Today the app is called Grandma's Gains, pulling in over $1 million a year, and Daniel answers my customer service line for minimum wage while I sit in a comfortable chair and watch the monthly revenue reports scroll in. Every time the phone rings at his cubicle, I like to imagine he remembers the exact moment his mother stopped being his mark and started being his boss. My name is Margaret, and I am 51 years old. For 22 years I stood in front of a middle school math classroom in Columbus, Ohio, teaching fractions and percentages and the order of operations to 8th graders who mostly wanted to be anywhere else. I could break down a compound probability problem into steps so clear a distracted 13-year-old could follow it, and that same patience later became a weapon my son didn't see coming. My husband Frank ran a small locksmith shop out of our garage, the kind of business where half the clients paid in cash and the other half paid in zucchini from their gardens. He could pick a Schlage deadbolt faster than I could find my car keys, and he once rekeyed the entire church parish hall in a single afternoon just because the pastor mentioned someone lost a master key. We lived in the same brick ranch house on Sycamore Street for 30 years, raised one child, and I would have told you we were the kind of boring, stable family that never makes headlines. I would have been wrong. A little over a year before Frank's heart gave out, our son Daniel came to us with a big idea. He had quit his marketing job 6 months earlier, burned through his savings building a fitness app called FlexFlow, some combination of AI-generated workout plans and real-time form correction using the phone camera. He had a working prototype and maybe 3,000 early users, but he needed serious capital to scale the back end, hire developers, and push user acquisition. The angel investors he had pitched wanted 40% equity for $500,000 and a board seat. Daniel sat at our kitchen table with the same hungry look I remembered from when he was 9 years old, trying to build a tree fort in the backyard and demanding we hold the plywood just so, convinced his vision was flawless and the rest of the world just needed to catch up. I felt that old pull, the one that had made me help with every science fair project and drive him to basketball tryouts at 5 in the morning and co-sign the lease on his first apartment, so I told him I could withdraw my 403(b), the retirement fund I had been feeding since my first paycheck at the school in 1994, $85,000. The exact number was $85,412 after the early withdrawal penalty and taxes, but I rounded it for him because I wanted to feel generous. We shook hands on 10% equity in the company. No lawyer, no formal paperwork beyond a handwritten note I tucked into a manila folder, just a promise over my kitchen table, and Daniel saying, "Mama, you'll be so proud. I'm going to pay you back 10 times over." Frank watched from his recliner with a coffee mug and said nothing. I should have noticed that silence. Frank had spent 40 years reading people the way he read a lark cylinder, feeling for the pin stacks that were set a little too shallow, the ones that would bind under tension. He knew something was off, but he didn't press me then. He just filed it away. Frank died on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, massive heart attack while he was alone in his workshop. The paramedics found him with a half-reassembled Mordai's lark cylinder still in his left hand, the pins spread across the workbench in neat little rows. I remember the sound the tool made when it fell onto the cement floor as the coroner's people lifted him. It was a small curved pick, and it hit the concrete with a high clear ping that cut through all the other noise in the house. For weeks afterward, that sound would come back to me at odd moments, while I was brushing my teeth or pouring coffee, and I would have to grip the counter to steady myself. The funeral was a blur of casserole dishes, and people I barely recognized saying things like "he's in a better place," and at least it was quick. Daniel and his wife Kelsey arrived late, Kelsey in a black pantsuit that looked brand new and cost more than my first car, a 1993 Honda Civic I bought for $600 off a colleague. Kelsey is the type of woman who curates her entire life for social media, a grid of immaculate kitchen counters, professionally styled seasonal decor, and a smile that never quite reaches her eyes. She worked in digital marketing before marrying Daniel, and I once overheard her on the phone describe me as wonderfully old school, like a living Hallmark card. I let it go then because that's what mothers do. We let things go. The day after the funeral service, the vultures began circling. Daniel and Kelsey showed up at 8 in the morning with expensive coffee and a clipboard. They said they wanted to take some things off my plate, that grief makes people foggy, and they were just looking out for me. Daniel kept patting my hand and saying I was in no shape to be alone, that they should handle the estate paperwork, the bills, the probate process, maybe even the house deeds, so I didn't have to worry about the county recorder and the death certificate and all that red tape. Kelsey's eyes swept the living room like she was already measuring for drapes and calculating the square footage. I told them I just needed a few days to rest and think, that I wasn't ready to make big decisions. That afternoon they started going through Frank's closet without asking. They pulled out old shirts and shoeboxes, making piles for donation, and I stood in the doorway watching Kelsey toss a dusty wooden box, maybe 8 inches by 5, onto a stack marked for the trash. It had a small brass latch with an integrated wafer lock, the kind of cheap lock you find on old cash boxes and desk drawers. She said, "This thing's full of old papers, probably tax forms from the 90s, it's worthless." I waited until she turned to criticize Frank's taste in sweaters, then I quietly picked it up and slipped it into the pocket of my oversized cardigan. The wood felt warm in my hand, or maybe I just wanted it to. Back in my bedroom, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The box was the kind Frank used to keep specialty pin kits in, the tiny wafer-thin pins for automotive locks. I probed the latch with my fingernail and found it unlocked, just grimy with years of workshop dust and the faint smell of graphite lubricant. Inside was a single leather-bound notebook, the same kind he always used to jot client orders and notes about tricky repairs, and the combination to a weird safe he encountered on a job. I opened it and flipped past pages of old lock diagrams and phone numbers until I reached the last written page. There in his neat block-letter handwriting with the fine point pen he always kept clipped to his shirt pocket were 6 words: "Do not trust Daniel. Save yourself." I stared at that sentence until the light through the blinds shifted from gold to grey. My husband, who never said an unkind word about our son out loud, had left me a last instruction. The man who had spent 40 years fixing things for other people had tried to fix this one thing for me before he died. I didn't understand what the warning meant yet, but the cold, hollow feeling settling in my chest told me I was about to find out. I closed the notebook and held it against my ribs and made myself a promise. I would not sign a single piece of paper until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family loyalty has to be earned, not taken for granted, and that sometimes the people who smile sweetest are the ones counting your silverware while you grieve. The morning after I found the box, Daniel and Kelsey came back with a stack of documents. They sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a tone of patient condescension. They said I was foggy, that the grief was making me forgetful, and it would give everyone peace of mind if I signed a durable power of attorney so they could handle the finances and medical decisions. Kelsey slid a document across the table while Daniel made sympathetic noises about the pressure of the estate and how he just wanted to protect me from having to make hard choices. Then they mentioned the house. Specifically, a quitclaim deed they just happened to have, to avoid probate, just a formality. I would still live here, of course. It was just cleaner this way legally. Kelsey added that the probate court could tie up the property for months, and didn't I want to have one less thing to worry about? And while we were at it, Daniel said, the app was bringing in a series around, a real venture capital infusion, and the new investors wanted to clean up the capitalization table. He used words like share restructuring and conversion ratio and down round protection, and assured me my 10% was safe, just a technical adjustment. I only needed to sign a consent to amend the operating agreement so they could close the deal. Kelsey added that they had already started the paperwork to move me into their guest room for a few weeks, just until I was feeling steadier, and wouldn't that be nice, to have family around? I looked at the stack of forms, at the tiny flags on the signature lines, at my son's face, which still had the same cowlick at the hairline he'd had since he was a toddler, and I remembered Frank's handwriting. I did the thing I had spent 10 years teaching 8th graders not to do. I played dumb. I let my eyes go a little unfocused and I said I was so tired my head hurt. Could I look at all this tomorrow when I could think straight? Daniel's jaw tightened for half a second before he smoothed it into a patient smile and said, "Of course. We just want what's best for you. Take your time." I tucked the papers into a folder and put it on the counter without signing a single line. That night I packed a single suitcase with the things I couldn't leave behind. My grandmother's quilt, a photo of Frank and me at the state fair, the wooden box, and the compact leather roll of lockpicks Frank had made me carry in my purse for years in case of emergencies. 2 days later, I was installed in their guest room, a beige box at the end of a long hallway in a mech mansion on the north side of town. The room had a brass bed frame Kelsey had bought from a catalogue, dust ruffles that matched exactly nothing else in the house, and a single window that looked out onto the HVAC unit. I brought my 3 items and I arranged them carefully, the quilt on the chair, the photo on the nightstand, the barks and the lockpicks in the bottom of a dresser drawer under a pile of old sweaters. I told them I was grateful for their hospitality. I smiled when they talked about getting me a life alert button and maybe a home health aide to stop by. I kept my head tilted just slightly to the side like a woman who couldn't quite track a conversation. The foggy grandmother act was my cover, and I maintained it with the same precision I used to apply to lesson plans. The first week in their house, I catalogued everything I could observe without appearing to observe anything at all. Daniel took phone calls at all hours, pacing in the finished basement with his voice pitched low but persistently angry. I positioned myself in the hallway near the basement door during his usual call times, pretending to water a potted plant that didn't belong to me, and I caught fragments. Something about a balloon payment due in 90 days, something about the bridge loan terms, the name Marcus repeated a dozen times with escalating fury. When he came upstairs his face was grey, and his knuckles were white around his phone. Kelsey, meanwhile, was on a spending spree that seemed disconnected from any visible income. She ordered an 8-foot marble dining table that required a freight delivery and 4 men to carry, a stationary bike with a built-in tablet that cost $4,000, and she announced they were taking a week-long trip to Bali for their anniversary. Every surface in the house was covered with catalogues and unopened boxes from high-end retailers, the kind of spending that feels less like wealth and more like a hostage situation with a credit card. The dissonance was jarring, a man angry about balloon payments and a woman ordering marble. Something was deeply wrong, and I was determined to find out what. The pivotal moment in my observation phase came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Kelsey had a fresh coffee from some place with an Italian name, and as she walked through the living room, she caught the edge of the rug with her heel and knocked the entire thing onto the cream-coloured wool. The stain spread like a brown bloom and she shrieked. She blamed the barista, the mug, the weather, and then announced she was late for Pilates class and left me to deal with the mess. No apology, no request, just the assumption that I would clean it up. I cleaned the rug myself with a mixture of hydrogen peroxide and Blue Dawn dish soap, a trick I learned from the custodial staff at the middle school when a student once knocked over an entire jug of grape juice during a science fair. I blotted, I dabbed, I repeated the process until the stain lifted completely, and by the time Kelsey returned, the rug looked brand new. She walked past it, glanced down, said good, and moved on. She never asked how I did it. That was the exact moment I understood they saw me as domestic machinery, a housekeeping unit that occasionally required a signature. In their minds, I was not a person with skills and a mind. I was a walking asset with a pulse. I needed evidence, so I made a plan. Their home office was just off the kitchen, a room with a solid core door and a Schlage keyed entry lock, model KS43. I knew Frank would have laughed at it. Growing up in a locksmith's household, I had absorbed things whether I wanted to or not. I had watched him repin cylinders at the kitchen table, explain the shear line to 9-year-old Daniel using coloured pencils, show me how a bump key worked when we had to get into the linen closet after the spring latch jammed. The leather roll in my purse contained a small hook pick, a half diamond, a city rake, and 3 tension wrenches of varying thicknesses, all made by Frank himself, filed from spring steel and heat-treated in a toaster oven. For that Schlage, I used a city rake with a tension wrench made from a windshield wiper blade insert, applying light torque and scrubbing the pins until I felt the plug rotate with a satisfying click. The lock turned in under 20 seconds. Frank would have been proud. The office was a mess of manila folders and sticky notes and empty energy drink cans. A lateral filing cabinet in the corner had a cheap wafer cam lock, the kind you can open with a jiggler or even a paper clip, but I used the same rake, and it surrendered immediately. The top drawer had a hanging folder labelled Flex Flow Corporate in Daniel's handwriting. Inside were the true papers, the ones I hadn't been meant to see. First, a term sheet from a firm called Apex Capital, the kind of predatory lender that charges 30% annual interest and demands personal guarantees from everyone even vaguely connected to the borrower. The guarantee page had my name, Margaret Walsh, and a signature. I held my own signature up in my memory, the one I'd written on 1,000 report cards, and compared it. My capital F loops the descender and crosses back through the stem. The forgery had a straight line, no loop, no crossover. A handwriting analyst would call it a blatant simulation. A yellow sticky note on the margin read, D's mom as co-signer, 403, B and house equity cover the collateral requirement. Below that another note, she signs were covered. Second, a shareholders' agreement with an amendment dated 2 weeks after Frank died. It showed the issuance of 1 million shares of Series, a preferred stock, to a newly created entity called DK Holdings, which I recognized as Daniel and Kelsey's initials. The preferred shares carried a liquidation preference of $6 per share, which meant that in any sale or dissolution, the first $6 million would go to the preferred holders before a single cent reached the common shareholders. My original common shares, which represented a straight 10% of the company, were now being diluted into a microscopic fraction of a rounding error. The cap table spreadsheet at the back had a line item for Margaret Walsh, common shares post-dilution value, $0.00. I photographed every page with my phone front and back, careful to capture the fine print, the barcodes, the sticky notes. I replaced the folders exactly as I found them, checking the alignment of the tabs. Then, while I still had access, I scanned the sticky notes on Daniel's monitor. One of them had a username and password for the company's Bitbucket repository, the code hosting platform where FlexFlow's entire source code lived. I recognized the credentials because I had helped set up that account in the early days, back when Daniel kept forgetting his passwords, and I had to write them on an index card I kept in my recipe box. He never changed the main admin login. I committed the credentials to memory and slipped out of the office, relocking the door and wiping the knob with my sleeve to remove any smudges. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat cross-legged on my guest bed with my ancient tablet and the encrypted external hard drive I had bought at a micro center during a weekly grocery run, paying in cash so there would be no credit card record. I logged into the Bitbucket repository using Daniel's admin credentials and executed a full clone of the entire codebase, every branch, every commit, every proprietary algorithm that powered the AI form correction and the workout planner. I exported the user database, the workout logs, the payment processing audit trails. I verified the file checksums twice, then transferred everything to the encrypted drive. The code was now mine, every single line that Daniel and his outsourced developers had written over the past 18 months, every keystroke of the app that was supposedly going to change the world. I also extracted the cloud infrastructure configuration files, which contained API keys and access tokens for the Amazon Web Services account that hosted the FlexFlow backend. With those keys, I could theoretically spin up an identical clone of the entire platform on a new set of servers in less than an hour. I didn't do anything with the data yet. I just made sure I had an immutable, untouchable copy stored on a drive small enough to fit inside a tampon box in my suitcase. While I was digging through the repository, I noticed a folder labeled Legal. Inside was the trademark application Daniel's lawyer had filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office for the mark FlexFlow. The application had a serial number and a filing date from 18 months earlier, but a subsequent office action letter showed the USPTO had issued a non-final rejection due to a likelihood of confusion with another pending mark. Daniel's lawyer had failed to respond within the 6-month deadline, and the application had gone abandoned 2 months before Frank died. That meant Daniel was operating an app with 500,000 downloads and no federal trademark protection at all. The name FlexFlow was effectively floating in unprotected space, usable by anyone willing to claim it. And then I remembered something Frank had said to me a year earlier, during one of the few arguments we ever had. I had just told him I was withdrawing the retirement money, and he had nodded slowly, and then he'd said, almost to himself, "I'll make sure the name is locked down. We don't want someone else walking off with it." I had assumed he meant he would talk to Daniel's lawyer, maybe help with the trademark paperwork, but Frank never trusted lawyers. Frank fixed things himself. I opened the wooden box again, and this time I went through every scrap of paper. Tucked behind the notebook, folded into a tight square, was a thin certificate of organization from the Ohio Secretary of State for an LLC called Franklin Holdings. The filing date was 6 months before Frank's death. The members were listed as Frank Walsh and Margaret Walsh, joint tenants with right of survivorship. The operating agreement, typed in Frank's own careful language, stated that upon the death of either member, the surviving member became the sole owner and manager. Attached to the certificate was a separate document, a registered trademark for the mark FlexFlow, with a valid serial number, a registration date, and all the classes correctly specified for software and fitness services. The owner of record was Franklin Holdings LLC. Frank had quietly, legally, and permanently locked the entire name, brand, and logo under a shell corporation that now, by right of survivorship, belonged entirely to me. Daniel had built a 500,000 download app on my intellectual property. He had diluted my equity to nothing, forged my signature on a predatory loan, and was actively trying to seize my house. And the one leverage point that could bring the whole house of cards down was sitting in an $8 wooden box I had nearly let Kelsey throw in the garbage. I needed to know how deep the conspiracy went, and I needed a real ally on the outside. I called an old colleague from my teaching days, a woman named Rita Harper, whose younger sister Beth Lindstrom was a partner at a boutique litigation firm that specialized in financial elder abuse and intellectual property disputes. I met Beth at a Panera Bread 40 minutes from the house, wearing sunglasses and a raincoat I'd bought at a thrift store, which in retrospect made me look exactly like a spy in a bad television drama. I told her everything in a corner booth over lukewarm soup. I laid out the photos of the forged documents, the trademark certificate, the operating agreement, the diluted shares, the illegal loan, and the cloned repository. Beth listened without blinking. She has the kind of face that gives nothing away, a poker face honed in federal courtrooms. When I finished, she opened her laptop and spent 30 minutes cross-referencing public records. The Ohio Business Registry, the USPTO database, the county recorder's office for the deed to my house, which thank God was still in Frank's name and mine. When she looked up, she said, "Margaret, you're holding a nuclear option and they don't even know it exists." She laid out the legal landscape in plain terms. The forgery alone was felony fraud and elder exploitation under Ohio's revised code, carrying a potential sentence of 5 to 10 years. The dilution of my shares without lawful notice and without board approval, since there never was a formal board, constituted a breach of fiduciary duty and could void the entire issuance under a constructive trust theory. The predatory loan with a forged guarantee could be unwound, and the Apex Capital people might even face criminal charges for failure to verify identity. And the trademark ownership meant Daniel had been selling a product under a mark he didn't own, which opened him up to statutory damages of up to $200,000 per instance of willful infringement. She asked if I wanted to go to the police immediately. I told her not yet. I wanted them to feel confident. I wanted them to hand me the final piece of rope. Beth brought in a forensic accountant named Kevin Okonkwo and an FBI agent from the local white-collar crime unit, a woman named Agent Chen. Kevin was a quiet man in a rumpled suit who could spot a manipulated spreadsheet from across the room. Agent Chen had the kind of calm intensity that made everything she said feel like it was already part of a case file. They coached me on what additional evidence would tighten the noose. Specifically, they needed an incontrovertible demonstration of intent to defraud me while I was in a vulnerable state, ideally recorded. Agent Chen provided a small key fob audio recorder disguised as a car remote, with a battery life of 18 hours and a microphone sensitive enough to pick up a whisper at 15 feet. I agreed to keep it on my person at all times. They also wanted me to wait until Daniel and Kelsey made an unmistakable overt move, such as physically taking me to a bank to execute documents. That would establish the fraud in motion and trigger the jurisdictional hooks the FBI needed. That moment came faster than I expected, thanks to a little performance I staged. I knew from the loan documents that the balloon payment on the Apex loan was due in 2 weeks, and a default would trigger immediate collection against my forged guarantee. Daniel was going to come at me hard for signatures, but I needed to test them first. I needed to know if any humanity remained, or if I was dealing with pure predators. So I arranged a medical scare. I spent the morning drinking nothing but water and a cup of strong black tea on an empty stomach. Around 11 o'clock, while Kelsey was in the kitchen scrolling on her phone, and Daniel was in the basement on yet another tense call with the man named Marcus, I stood up from the sofa, let my knees buckle consciously, and crashed onto the floor. I made sure to knock over the side table and shatter the ceramic lamp on the way down, so the sound would echo through the whole first floor. Then I went completely limp, eyes closed, breathing slow and shallow through my nose. The crash was loud. I heard Kelsey's footsteps approach, then stop. She said in a tone of pure exasperation, "Oh my God, she did it again. Not, are you okay? Not, let me call 911. Again. As if my distress was a recurring household inconvenience she was tired of managing. I lay there with my cheek pressed against the cold tile, the grain of the grout pressing into my skin, and I heard my own pulse thudding in my ears like a slow metronome. Her heels clicked away and I heard her call down the basement stairs. "Daniel, your mother collapsed or something, I don't know." He came up, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. He stopped within a foot of my head. I felt the air shift when he leaned over me, a displacement like someone leaning over a puddle to see if it's deep enough to step in. And then he said, not quite quiet enough, she's out. Grab the folder from her nightstand, the one with the deed and the signature pages. If she's still groggy when she wakes up, we can get her to sign the whole stack. I'll call Dr. Reynolds later and tell him she needs a sedative, something to keep her calm. They stepped over my body. Kelsey's shoe actually brushed a strand of my hair as she passed. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close, then I got up slowly, brushed the ceramic dust off my elbow and walked to the guest bathroom. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the tub with the light off. I did not cry. I had been a mother for 28 years. Every skinned knee, every fever, every late-night conversation about nothing important, and in the end I was just an obstacle between him and a loan payment. That was the moment my son died a second time. The first was when Frank passed. This was when I buried the version of Daniel I had been protecting since he was a child. The recording device in my cardigan pocket had captured every word with devastating clarity. Agent Chen later told me the audio was so pristine the prosecutor played it in the grand jury presentation as Exhibit A, and one of the jurors actually gasped. 3 days later, Daniel announced over breakfast that we were making a trip downtown. He had scheduled the house signing appointment at the bank, he said, and after that we could get lunch somewhere nice. He even used the phrase "make it a mom date," smiling in that way that made his crow's feet crinkle exactly like they had when he was a little boy showing me a crayon drawing. I smiled and said that sounded lovely, I just needed to use the restroom first. In the bathroom I sent a prearranged text to Beth, code Magnolia. That single word activated everything. Then I adjusted the key fob recorder sewn into the hem of my cardigan, took a deep breath and walked out to meet my son. The bank was a first-floor branch of a regional institution, the kind of place with glass-walled offices and a hush of money moving through the carpet fibers. A man in a navy suit and a name tag that read Greg led us to a conference room with a long, polished table. On the table were a water pitcher and a stack of documents, the quitclaim deed on top, and beneath it the amended operating agreement for Flex Flow, plus a separate document purporting to ratify the loan guarantee I had allegedly agreed to in my fog of grief. Daniel's pen was already out, a heavy silver thing with his initials engraved on the clip. Kelsey sat beside me, patting my arm as if we were about to do something heartwarming and intergenerational. Greg the banker slid the papers toward me and explained each one in a tone that suggested he was reading from a script written by their legal department. I picked up the silver pen. I looked at Daniel, his eyes wide with something that looked like hope, but was really just impatience, the same look he'd get as a kid waiting for me to finish signing his permission slip so he could run out to the bus. I set the pen down. I said, "I taught you how to tie your shoes, Daniel. You cried for 2 hours because the rabbit wouldn't go around the tree. But I also taught you that some knots only pull one way. This knot is about to pull exactly the way Frank intended." The conference room door opened. Beth Lindstrom walked in carrying a slim leather briefcase, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers and Agent Chen in a dark suit. Behind them, a federal marshal in a windbreaker waited in the hallway with his hand resting on the doorframe. Beth placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside was the trademark certificate for Flex Flow showing Franklin Holdings LLC as owner and me as sole surviving member, the high-resolution photos of the forged signature with the handwriting analyst's preliminary report, the Apex loan documents with the forensic accountant's affidavit tracing the money to Daniel's personal account, the audio transcript of Daniel and Kelsey stepping over my collapsed body and discussing sedation, and a motion for a constructive trust and preliminary injunction that Beth had already filed electronically that morning. Agent Chen read them their Miranda rights in a voice that could have been describing the weather, while Kelsey's face went the color of old milk left in a cup. Daniel tried to grab the deed off the table, and the federal marshal stepped forward and said a single word, "Don't." The next few weeks were a storm of legal motions and hearings. The criminal charges covered elder abuse, forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft from a protected person. The civil case, which Beth filed as a countersuit against Daniel's attempt to sue me for allegedly stealing the source code, was a layered masterpiece. It alleged breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, common law fraud, trademark infringement, and a constructive trust claim on the app itself. We argued that the entire business was built on my original investment, my personal guarantee that I never authorized, and my trademark, and that the dilution scheme was void from its inception. Beth sought a constructive trust that would award me full equitable ownership of the entity and all its assets. The discovery phase was brutal for Daniel's side. Kevin, the forensic accountant, traced the financials, and found that the series of venture capital investors had pulled out the moment they caught wind of the legal cloud. The only money coming in was the Apex loan, which was now frozen. Daniel's operating capital evaporated in a matter of days. Kelsey's parents hired a separate attorney and tried to distance themselves, issuing a press release to their country club that they were deeply saddened by the recent family misunderstanding. The court granted a preliminary injunction freezing all FlexFlow assets and appointing a neutral receiver to maintain the app's operations while the litigation proceeded. And while that happened, I launched my clone of the app. With the source code I had backed up, my registered trademark, and a small team of developers Beth helped me vet, I rebuilt the backend on a clean Amazon Web Services cluster using the API keys and configuration files to replicate the architecture exactly. I pushed an updated version of the app to both the Apple and Google App Stores under a new name, Grandma's Gains. The interface was the same, the AI workout engine intact, but I added a feature I had always wanted during my years of teaching. A gentle voiceover option that said things like "Let's get those steps in, sweetheart, and remember to hydrate, you're doing great." It went viral among the over 40 demographic within a week. I kept the data migration strictly opt-in, sending every existing FlexFlow user an in-app notice explaining the situation in plain language and offering a seamless transfer that preserved their workout history and achievements. 78% migrated within the first month. FlexFlow became a ghost town, its servers humming with nothing but the occasional spam bot. The lawsuit reached a settlement because Daniel's lawyers knew they were facing certain defeat at trial, and their client was running out of money to pay them. The terms were negotiated over 3 days in a federal mediation room with a retired judge and a lot of bad coffee. I received full ownership of the FlexFlow entity, the application, its code, its intellectual property, and the remaining user base, in exchange for dropping part of the monetary damages to avoid protracted appeals. Daniel agreed to a stipulated judgment of $1.1 million for the fraud and elder exploitation, and part of the settlement required that he work for the company, in any reasonable capacity I assigned, until his restitution balance was paid in full. I assigned him to customer service. He sits in a cubicle at the far end of a small office park building I rented with a portion of the first month's revenue, wearing a headset and reading from a script that requires him to refer to the founder as Mrs. Walsh. He makes minimum wage, garnished directly into the restitution fund, and every Friday his supervisor sends me a spreadsheet with his call metrics. His handle time is average, his customer satisfaction scores are adequate. Kelsey now works as a receptionist at a dental clinic, and their McMansion was sold at auction to cover part of the Apex loan deficiency. The rest of her marble furniture ended up on Facebook Marketplace. Grandma's Gains crossed $1.2 million in valuation last quarter. I did not need the money, not anymore, not with Frank's life insurance and the pension from the school district, but I kept the business because I am good at it, and because I enjoy it. Every time I see the subscriber count tick up, or read an email from a 60-year-old woman in Nebraska who says the app helped her walk a 5K for the first time, I think about Frank sitting in his workshop with a jeweler's loupe, patiently cutting keys for people who had lost everything and needed a new way in. He left me a key and I used it to unlock a door neither of us could have imagined. The moral of this story, if you need one, is that the people who build you up and the people who tear you down can sometimes wear the same face. The difference is what they do when they think you are not looking. And if you ever find yourself holding a small, dusty box with a warning inside, for heaven's sake, don't let anyone throw it away. Read the fine print, keep a backup, and never underestimate the quiet ones. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you believe that family is a verb, something you do every day, not just something you owe by blood, then hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your lockpicks ready.